set.
All right.
Mama was ready to land.
Hello, Earl, thank you so much for having us here to Phalen, and thank you for so much stuff you've been doing for Charter Folk and for Indianapolis, but to also host us for a conversation here. It's so great. Brandon, thank you for being here as well. This is going to be a Charter Folk chat, which we will be distributed, and what brings us here is the fact that the Mind Trust is having a celebration this week to celebrate 20 years as an organization, but it just so happens to occur at a moment when just some very important breakthroughs have happened. So it's great that that's occurred. You say, hey, let's go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity and record something. And it's that interplay between what our schools are doing and what our advocates are doing that I think is the key difference maker. I know that having champions like art is great. I know it's important to have a great governor like Mitch Daniels, all of those things that are kind of out of our control. And then I think actually the most important thing is what's within our control. And so I'll just start with thank you to both of you for exactly who you are, but also what you represent, which is schools and advocates doing some amazing stuff. So I want to understand a little bit more just about your advocates and the organization, but I mean, from your guys' standpoint, if I was going to ask, why are we here? Why are we in Indianapolis? What is it here? And I'm sure now you guys are having regular conversations along these lines. You're probably getting some strong responses, or maybe you're trying things and you're learning different ways to talk about it to residents and different audiences. But Earl, would you mind just getting us started? What has happened in Indianapolis? And also, you're in parts of the country now, many parts of the country, so you see also what's unique about this place. How do you talk about the Indianapolis experience?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. Obviously, you have the Mind Trust giving great advocacy and kind of laying the framework for boards, at least at the beginning, that were very open to a portfolio type of approach within the school, to obviously legislation that was favorable to charter operators. Mind Trust also has a fellowship, so I'm a Bostonian, right? So I never expected to be putting my energy into Indianapolis at any point, but this fellowship came to the attraction of talent. And there are 20, 30, or 40 of us now that have been attracted to Indianapolis to focus on Indianapolis. And then having major philanthropic investors like Lilly Endowment, like Glick Philanthropies, sets a stage for opportunity. When I first came here, we were blessed to get approved for 10 charters. That's we were running a summer learning program, it was evidence-based, but we never run a school. So to have that flexibility of being able to build a big enough team here that we could have the infrastructure to recruit, to enroll, to work with families, et cetera, was really an important attraction to the community. I think, David Harris, Brandon's predecessor, really emphasized to me, Earl, I know you feel a sense of urgency because Black and brown children and poor white children are struggling, but take the time. And so the fellowship really gives you 2 years to do it right. And even with the 2 years, we still started late on some things. So I think having that, so all those factors together and many others have made Indianapolis a great place to serve.
Well, it's a place where I think the national movement is being driven by the city and by its community of people. So to hear you characterize it, I've got like 12 questions I return to. Brandon, how do you talk about that in the experience? First question.
Yeah, so testing. The original charter school law, was 2001. And the unique thing about that law is that the mayor of Indianapolis had the ability to be an authorizer, which had never happened before in the history of the country. So from 2001 to 2006, not only did the mayor have the legal authority, but he actually used it. And the growth of high quality charter schools in the early years really set the stage for a broader conversation around what does the North Star and the ecosystem need to look like to actually expand great schools for every kid. And that really was the genesis of what became the Mind Trust. So we're celebrating 20 years. We're excited tomorrow to have over 1,100 members of our community And it's going to just be, hopefully just a giant celebration of 2 decades of progress. And I think we need to be honest that there's still a lot more work to be done. Nobody can say, that we've accomplished what we set out to yet. And, so I think trying to hold those two things at once, like being really proud of the incredible progress and being clear that there's more work to do to finish the job for kids. And I think it's very appropriate that we're here today because one of the first fellows of the Mind Trust was Earl. And, maybe it's hard to see 20 years later, but the Mind Trust was just an idea. We had some crazy ideas, and it took folks like Earl to actually take a risk in us so that over time we could build the credibility as an organization, that eventually had a track record of working with amazing entrepreneurs like Earl. So, it took him taking a plunge in this random Midwestern town with this new organization that had a crazy idea. And not only did he launch the summer program here, but then a few years later, we were able to award $1 million into his organization to, think about what would a charter network look like. And then he did the Innovation School Fellowship when we had an opportunity to work with IPS. So at many points in our journey, Earl and PLA have been part and parcel with what we have done at the Mind Trust. And, looking back on it now, it all seems, natural and obvious, but it really took Earl saying, what about Indianapolis? What about the Mind Trust? And I think now, the completely transformed system where 62% of kids attend charter schools, we have new system level reforms that put every school on one playing field, one accountability framework, we're sharing local money equitably. All that was a pipe dream 20 years ago, and it takes great people along the way to be persistent, and to continue to break down system barriers, even when it seems impossible.
It's that sustained effort over decades that is so unique about Indianapolis, and among the things that are unique. Also, that willingness over that period of time, not simply to exist as an organization, or not simply to exist as a community of schools, but to be constantly pressing. It's not enough. We are not finished. What is the next thing? And in all sorts of other cities, we've seen us hit shelves, hit moments, and it's like, maybe it's a combination of factors. Maybe we lose sight of the vision ourselves. Maybe the blowback gets to be so hard. Maybe our movements never figured it out before. Maybe we grow wobbly and comfortable because, hey, we've all built okay jobs first. Whatever it is, there's something about a community that happens that said, we aren't about shelves. We are not about reaching someplace that is not the end point we want for our kids, and you don't really get to an end point. It's a new paradigm, right? But the key thing, Earl, it doesn't go anywhere unless kids are, arguably being served better than they were before. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about PLA. What is the scope of the undertaking that you're taking on right now? And how is that been a part of the Indianapolis story? And then once you've done that, also maybe cast a little love on a few of your other operators who you respect here in Indianapolis. We're doing genuinely great things as well. But please share with us. I love that you do both startup schools and you do conversion schools. And it's that two-pronged approach that we've lost the thread of in so many other parts of the country. It's now starting to dawn on us that we're supposed to do it, but you've lived it, right? You've made great startup schools, and you've done great innovation schools too. So in your answer, if you wouldn't mind at least touching a little bit on that project of mine, I'd love that as well.
Yeah, clearly the leaders, in the sector, Paramount, Herod, Believe, they're doing a phenomenal job with scholars. When I first arrived, Tidley was the North Star. They were the standard of excellence within the community. And so, when we started as this year, we got approved for 10 charters to serve 9,000 scholars. And we thought we were going to put them all right here in Indianapolis. And, first school was an old car dealership, but we had to raise $2.5 million, right, to get it started. And so then you start to think, well, gosh, if we have to raise $25 million, I've had relative success back in the East Coast where I, spent most of my time. but didn't have the same relationships here, didn't go to the local high school here, didn't go to IU, right? And so the relationships that I was able to leverage at home to raise a lot of philanthropy started to have us think. So after our first school was doing fairly well, and scholars had passed the I rating 100% the first 2 years, the then superintendent, Dr. Farabee, came out and said, hey, we're doing this innovation thing. First school is going to be on the Far East Side, which is the toughest part of Indianapolis, and we'd love you to take the lead on it. And I said, hell no, right? Nobody's doing that. Even the big charters, even the successful national charters, right? They weren't doing turnaround, and when they did do turnaround, they ended up running up with their tail between their legs because it's a different level of work and different level of intensity and different level of resources that need to be successful. But then, Mind Trust called and said, hey, would you consider it? And then, Marion Glick called and said, hey, would you consider it? And so, they resourced us well enough that we felt like, you know what, raising $25 million a year may take us a minute. Why don't we try to go where children already are, where neighborhoods need a good school, where parents are trusting that the school is good, although enrollment has been declining in 103, and see if we can go in with some of the things we've learned. Also, because we came from the summer space and with Summer Advantage, we thought about, we're pretty good at pop-up schools, right? Getting in quickly, getting the culture right really quickly, and getting to instruction and helping children, grow by 2 months as opposed to that 3-month summer learning loss. So we kind of said, I think we can do it. We grossly underestimated how hard it was. We grossly underestimated the number of resources that we'd need. We've made just dozens and dozens of mistakes throughout the last 12 years. But some of the things that we've done well, the community loves us because we love that, and they know that, and nobody could question that at all. B, the effort to partner with our families and show respect to our families, that this is a journey, this is your child, this is our scholar, let's take this journey side by side. So that has been a strength of ours. And then we've been phlanthropist to have leaders like Nicole Phalen, who leads our region here, start to then add we can get the culture right, but the academics, and so start to add the richness around the academics, and that's why all of our schools, because of growth, and to Brandon's point, not because of proficiency, but all of our schools in Indianapolis are A-rated, right? And that's been under Nicole's leadership and that drive. We have 3,000 miles to go. But I'm always so heartened when I come back and hear, one of them, we just on the FaceTime with one of our scholars. And she's up at IU. She's a 4.0 GPA, right? And just rocking it there. And we have scholars down at Xavier, I won't go on to every scholar, but it's wonderful to see that, okay, we're not there yet, but there's been a lot of progress. And so our mix was originally Fresh Start School, then PLA at 103, which is right around the corner, as a turnaround school. And then another innovation school in 93 joined the network. And so we said, okay, we're starting, but we want our kids to go next. And there's a school down the street where it was, fights every day, teachers getting beat up, kids getting beat to go to school there. It was just an absolute disaster. And so the charters allowed us to say, well, could we make that an innovation school? Nobody wanted to take on John Marshall as a turnaround, because high school turnaround is not even that crazy. So the thought was, well, can we use a charter and create a middle school here, right? And so that was our middle school, which is half of this 120,000 square foot building in which we sit. And then same question, well, where are kids going to go to high school? Because Marshall still existed at that point. And we said, all right, well, let's create a high school. And our kids didn't want to leave this environment. I mean, when you walk through PLC schools, you feel love, right? And our kids wanted this. Our kids have homes, but they wanted this second home for them to a safe place, loving place, a place that was driving them thinking about their futures academically or career-wise. And then obviously helping them develop as young people. So that's been a little bit of our journey. Now we're 26 schools and 10,000 scholars in 5 states. But we've also realized in our time here, the poverty is so intractable. And it's almost like an orbital force that is nearly impossible to disengage from. And so we started to realize gosh, I didn't want us to do sports even though I played basketball in college. I didn't want us to do sports because I really wanted us to focus on the academics. And our scholars were like, yeah, it's fine. So I'm just not going to go to your school, right? So we're like, all right, well, now we'll have basketball and football track, right? And so even though we don't have basketball, football track stadium, although we're now, but you start to go deeper. You say, okay, well, now we need the sports, we need the student government. So we're getting scholar leadership. Wait a second, our families are 93% of in poverty. Is there any chance that we could put together something that could help our families get short-term training and do a better job with family members? We started Skilled US, a workforce development program 3 years ago. 10,000 people with that program. Several thousand graduated right in Indianapolis. The average graduate making 35,000 more close to the benefit in 6 days. You help with family members, then you can do that. Just GD Scholar, which is a college access for assistance program. Indiana is less than 20% school program. So that's full tuition at 58, 59 public and private institutions. But you only see a 30% graduation rate because of the same factors that first generation low income students, you know what they are, right? And so we create just wants that program to lay down and support. So I'm talking to Earl, and people like to back to you, but those are some of the things of like how do you go deeper, how do you go deeper? Almost I've never had a goal. I almost had to see because the car doesn't work. Will you try to get basketball, football, volleyball? So you see construction happening. Thank God we just did graduation last week. A year from now, we've got to have home fields for our scholars so that our families can see it. And then that's another sense of community energy and community pride. It's really good. That's way behind us.
I want to ask a couple of questions about your origins. How questions. But before we go there, Randy, can you just broaden your buyers that are here in us, and how have they found their uniqueness, but also what is its conflict across them in terms of commitment to keep pushing for something that maybe other cities have thus far shown?
Yeah, I think that there are probably 2 or 3 pretty unique things about the operator group here in Indy. One is that we're almost entirely locally run. So we don't have big national CMOs outside of KIPP. We have amazing school leaders that have business. And then once you get a track record of success, we've seen a lot of locally run networks. And I think with that, the bond between school and community here is very, very tight. I would also say that in general, our school leaders reflect our kids. A very racially diverse group of school leaders. And if you look at our faculty, it's the same thing. So when we hear the criticisms of charter schools, they're just not true at all in our city. It's not that we're perfect. This is a locally grown effort. So I think that's one. 2 is I think that our school model diversity is incredible. I personally don't think that school choice is actually school choice unless you have real choices to choose from. And I think the high school level in particular, the diversity in school models match the quality. I would probably put that here. I would say it's anybody in the country. Schools that generally break the mold and were designed to look very different from what we're used to. I think it's really. To Earl's point, when we got the ability in 2014 with the Innovation School Law, work really closely with IPS, to create our high-quality schools, what we quickly learned, and I heard this from Chris Bartlett probably over a decade ago, most operators want to be 72 sunny in order to tee off, right? You can't ensure that every single kid in a self-bar system has access to a great school if you want the conditions to be absolutely pristine every time you push a school. So it took a few operators, and the first one was Earl, to actually say, you know what, like I'm not going to tee off when it's going to be 72 and sunny every time. I'm going to go into a hurricane, and I'm going to do it because that's the most important work that has to get done. And it's not been perfect. We've learned a lot. The reality is we're not going to get to kids running great schools in any major city in the country unless we're able to do work like that. And I think we challenge our sector to recast our vision. And we're doing work in the city that goes for every single access to trees. And that means that we're going to have to come in sometimes. It means that we're not always going to get, all the results that we want right away. But that level of persistence and commitment, to a community means that you're going to have to take some risks. And I think we've been fortunate, in our community to have people like Earl and others who chose to tee off when it was not pristine outside. And I think that's kind of one of the untold reasons why we are where we are today. If you look at the restart schools, they're not perfect, but every single one of those schools is quantifiably better than what it was before the restart. The enrollment at every one of those schools has skyrocketed. So many of these schools were schools that most of our families did not want to send their kids to, and you saw every year the enrollment continue to go down. That trend immediately reverses after restart almost every single time. So not only are we seeing, meaningful, quantifiable improvements academically, but we're seeing a lot of families actually opt back into the system because now they're seeing something different. And then lastly, we're a year and a half out from a $400 million capital referendum that will give every IPS, middle school and high school, world-class athletic facilities. And I agree with Earl. I don't think that the two of us are in this for athletics, but we ought to be in this to make sure that our schools are worthy of our children. And if students who attend direct managed IPS schools are worthy of world-class athletic facilities, our kids are too. And that's why I'm excited for projects like this here at this campus, because if we actually have a vision, to serve all kids well, then we can't just do some things well. We have to actually take responsibility for the entire system. And we're in Indiana, and we're Hoosiers here, and we love our basketball and our football. So,
love that. So, an idea. I love that how you talk about the community just fully embracing Phalen at this point, but also that being a function of Phalen really making this a priority. I'm thinking of Earl Bryant, Collegiate Academies in New Orleans, and he talked about New Orleans in a podcast that we did not so long ago. He kept talking about there is no New Orleans experience. We kept learning, we kept changing, we kept making mistakes. But his one of his conversion schools, the community is so proud of it now. They're so proud of it, and so they've just about submitted to me now a charter contributor column from them about how much they love their charter school. So, I'd love to have another one. I mean, I'd take anything from you, Earl, but but can you talk about what we may have learned about conversion, turnaround? I think that I personally, and also my entry point to charter is through voluntary conversion. Just being in a broken district school and being able to introduce the idea of charterness into our community and realizing as people learn more about it, just how compelling it can be to take control of their own destiny. But in some instances, charter becomes penalty. Charter becomes punishment. We force you to do it, whether you want to do it or not. And I think we're learning that that's not a very good way to do things. In terms of teeing things up, improperly for ourselves earlier. But to my knowledge of the innovation story is there may have been, some more harshness or forcedness early on, but as that got its own momentum, that really wasn't as much the picture. And there was active buy-in from communities to have their schools go in this direction. You've been doing this now over many years. How has our thinking evolved about, what are the conditions for allowing a district school to convert to charter school status and be very successful?
Yeah, I think as you think about barriers to starting a school, right? You have the barrier of a facility. Can you get a facility? Can you finance a facility? A lot of people can't do that. You have the challenge of, even if you get the facility, when we first launched our first school in 23rd Illinois, Georgia, Veronica thing, we got 522 applications. We're like, oh God, we're hit our enrollment. Yeah. We had 124 kids show up, right? So it's like, do you have this you have an enrollment risk that is sort of mitigated, to Brandon's point. The neighborhood is finding ways to use different addresses to get out when the schools are terrible. You lower the enrollment risk piece. You have transportation provided by the district, so that also helps with, so those conditions allow you to do the turnaround at one level. We're kind of seeing that even in the best circumstances, almost like a football team, if you don't have the right quarterback, you're not good, period. And PLA made a lot of mistakes in terms of, we can get a person who's been in district, we can get a person who's done this, and we just didn't have good systems and processes for finding out who could be the starting quarterback in this environment, a turnaround environment. So we've gone a lot deeper on this. Originally I thought, we've got to find a way to do this on public dollars alone, for it to be sustainable and for it to be scalable. And my experience, maybe others have been different in the turnaround environment, you just can't do that. I mean, you need $2,000 to $3,000 extra dollars per scholar to provide the reading interventions that are going to close gaps, the math interventions, the extended learning, the summer learning, making sure you find the best teachers and are able to keep the best teachers, because the districts, I mean, when I came here, the district, I think it was 36,000 was the starting salary, right? And now it's what, 52 or 50 something?
I think it was 60 now.
Right, so the district can just drop these things, and your teachers love the kids, they love PLA, they love the community, but for $15,000 more, you have to take care of your family and your loved ones, so you understand. So to keep up with that, you have to be well resourced. So those are some of the conditions, again, that have allowed us to be moderately okay. No, I take that back. To be successful, we're not even halfway up the mountain yet, but we've had a lot of success with our scholars and families. But we've got to get better at the leadership. We've got to get better at having enough resources to do everything that our scholars need for our scholars and our families to be successful. And that's what we're trying to do.
And to your point too, so several of these schools were voluntary conversions, including School 93, which had Nicole Fama, who is an amazing leader, and a group of families who actually organized at school board meetings to say, we want to convert to innovation school status. And there were several schools over the course of a few years who did that, which was some of my favorite work in my 11 years at the Mind Trust. I mean, I guess I can say this. I was at one of the school board meetings where the conversion vote was on the agenda, and I was sitting right behind the president of the local teachers union. And to see her own members form a line at the mic asking the board to vote to approve their conversion to innovation school status, I mean, that image is vividly seared in my mind. So I think you're exactly right. We can't frame charter schools as the punishment for low-performing schools. It needs to be a model that has conditions that great educators want to opt into. In my experience, great leaders in any sector, including education, want the autonomy to make decisions. They want to know what the expectations are, and they're completely fine with being held rigorously accountable for results. And that's all we're doing in the charter school sector, right? We're saying we trust educators. We trust them more than a faraway central office. In exchange for that autonomy, you got to make quantifiable progress for your kids or you're going to get shut down. And I actually think the best educators in our city over time have flocked to schools that have those key conditions in them.
Just like, Clinton was one of our great political masterminds from the very beginning, and so many of the schools that he visited in the early going were the conversion schools. Because it's if all you are is a bunch of startup schools and you have this vision, well, you're one massive replacement strategy. And look, I don't think any of us should wait. If we got to replace things that aren't working, let's do it. But the presentation of our movement is so much different. If we say the chartering mechanism can not just only turn around failing schools, but every school. We can help you get even better. And it gives us the right posture with teachers and school principals. You're not the problem. You're a precious resource that everybody wants to acknowledge the contribution that you're making and wants to acknowledge how much you care about your community. We are here to help you be even better than you've been before. That is a completely different entry point. And it's the one that I do think puts the status quo interest on the defense. And that's frankly where we want them. I want to get on some of the brass knuckle stuff here, but, and just courage and stuff like that, because I think it's a part of it. But before getting to that, I think it's the connection to the work that's just super important to like explore out of both of you guys. Earl, you said that you grew up in Boston.
Yes.
Did you spend your entire childhood in Boston?
Yeah,
So,
4 years in Connecticut, yeah.
okay. I went to school with a guy from Boston, from Mansfield.
Okay.
And one of the funniest conversations of my whole life was in my freshman year in our dorm together, when he and I discovered that his birthday was 7 months after his parents got married. 7 months. I think I better call my mom. But the other thing, years later, we pieced together, why did we live in Mansfield? He had grown up or he had been born, and they were in Boston. But right when all of the busing stuff happened, and that's why they left. That's why they left. And so that feeling of connectedness for him, even though he's not in education, but to understand the education issues with that as it, I mean, and I've written a lot about the Boston experience. I think that the 50th anniversary of the busing problems in '74 are ones that, when our world understands those things more deeply, this is why our world was born. To make sure that this kind of segregation that was like put on our schools and where educational opportunity was being unfairly allocated. And where, when you don't set up your schools well, you have horrid behavior that certain folks can demonstrate in those moments. When our world understands we're a salve for all that. Wait a second. We don't force kids to go anywhere. We can evolve such that there's only one selective admission school in the entire city of India, or in IPS, right? So can you just talk to me a little bit about your background in Boston? What's your sense of connection to the historical unfairness cooked into the very DNA of public education? How does it motivate what you're doing to this very day? And how does it make you look at the progress that's happening in Indianapolis, unlike almost what you see in any other city of America?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm adopted. My mom had me at 16, and I went into Massachusetts foster care for the first 2 years of my life. And I was adopted by George and Veronica Phalen, an Irish Catholic, my mom and dad. And then they had 7 children actually born to my mom and dad. And then decided that they had enough love in their heart to adopt a child, because it was a front page article in the Boston Globe that said 70% of Black boys born into foster care would end up in the penal system by the time that they were 21. So, growing up with that background, and now, across 2 generations, I have 64 nephews and nieces, and we're every race in our families, others have chosen to adopt. It grounds you in when children are given the opportunity to thrive, right? 70% chance I was going to go and end up in jail. But instead, I graduated from Yale University, I graduated from Harvard Law School, and I get to spend the last 32 years trying to give back to others as was given to me. That grounds you in the work, because you know that with the right opportunity, children will thrive. And if children don't have the right opportunity, they will struggle. And that's not their fault, right? That's our responsibility as adults. And so my mom was watching the Boston dynamic. She was watching, obviously, television had become more popular. She was watching dogs being sicked on African Americans down in Alabama and throughout the South. She was seeing the lynchings and the photographs of the lynchings, and white men with their boys celebrating it as if it was a happy event, right? So you see the inhumanity, and so my mom wanted to be a freedom writer. And my dad was like, we have 7 kids under the age of 18, no, that's not gonna work out for our family. And so the compromise was, well, there's an article, let's adopt. And so that's in the spirit of everything that we do at PLA. And that's why when I say in every one of our buildings, you will feel loved, because that's how I was raised, and that's how, even religiously, I grew up Roman Catholic, I'm not anymore, but but the notion that you're supposed to care for those, the least of these, right? Those who have the greatest obstacles, those who are, but we're all still God's children. We all still have this incredible innate potential if somebody's will support it. And so that's what we try to do, at PLA, and that's what drives our work.
Randy, you might talk about your just kind of personal connection to some of the social justice issues that come out of work like this.
Yeah, I don't know how you want me to top that. See, you always go with him first, Judd, and then me. But yeah, so I am the oldest of five. My mom and dad were high school sweethearts. They got married when they were 18 and 20, so about 2 months after my mom graduated from college. From high school. And my dad was going to go to college, and then he came home 2 weeks later because he missed my mom. And then I was born when they were 19 and 21. I have done the math. I think I was 5 weeks early, so it checks out barely. And I try not to think about much more than that. So I was always the oldest in my family, so I, had to develop a lot of responsibilities at home. But then when I was in college, my mom and dad called me when I was a junior, and they said, we're going to adopt a little girl from an orphanage in China. And what? Why would you do that? You're going to start again? And they were like, just because we feel called to, and we're young enough to do it, and why not? So that really shaped me when I was figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. You have this amazing 13-month-old, who one day was in an orphanage, and then the next day she was with my family. And it hit me that she was probably going to have access to good schools. She was probably going to have a lot of privileges that millions of children who have lived their whole life in our country are not going to have. And it just struck me as fundamentally unfair. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to try to commit my life to this. And that was kind of the reason why I, chose to join TFA. And then when I was in the classroom, I love teaching, but I'm really impatient. And I had these 4 walls in my classroom, and I saw all these major system issues that just seemed really unfair to me. And wanted to move back home to Indianapolis. And then have been fortunate to work in the mayor's office as the charter schools director, and then now for well over a decade at the Mind Trust. And I think over time, I've even gotten more impatient. I want to tell a quick story. So when Earl was negotiating the first innovation school contract on a napkin with Dr. Farradeens, literally how it was negotiated, nobody knew what the hell they were doing. Well, I would say it is still the greatest deal in the history of innovation schools, and they rub it in my face every time we can. But in the first 2 or 3 years of that work, we had an amazing relationship with IPS, right? Worked hand in glove with them, and it was just kind of hard to believe, honestly. And we would be in meetings together, and he would take one approach, I would take one approach, and his approach was much more direct than mine. And I remember calling him after a few meetings saying, you know what, if you could just tone it down a little bit, we're trying to manage this relationship, and let's be partners. And over time, I think we actually switched where, he's like, hey, Brandon, aren't you proud of me? I'm being so nice to people, and I'm not saying any bad words. And I'm like, man, that needs to rub off on me because I am sick of this shit. We need to start pushing harder. And it took people like Earl, who had more life experience than I, and who had been working up against these systems for, a lot longer than I have, and a lot of really challenging contexts, to kind of keep me honest, and to remind me that it's not just about the personal relationships or the affection that you feel for somebody who's working in the system. This is not about the people, it's about the system. And I realized over time, amazing reform-minded people, the longer you're in the system, the more you lose your edge, and the more you kind of get the life sucked out of you, to be honest with you. And it took me several years, to realize that this is not, just about kumbaya. It's not, just about your relationships. Yes, that's important, and yes, partnership's important. But to transform a system that is built to withstand most of what you're trying to do, it's going to take persistence, it's going to take conflict. And there are points where you have to run into that conflict, whether or not you like it. And it took me a while to learn that, but one of my teachers was Earl, and now he has to calm me down when I get really upset. So,
Well, just your studying the great stories right now is exactly why I kind of have a habit of asking that question. And I also think we went through a 3 or 4 year period, maybe even longer than that, where we weren't having those, we weren't asking those questions of one another as often. And we paid for that. We paid for that. There were some reasons too. I think the ways many of us talk about our early years, especially white, more affluent people, there could have been some tone wrongness in the ways we were talking about our within communities and those kinds of things. But, you know, Taylor Branch in the introduction to the King biographies that he did, you know, he talked about his love of the United States being born of the notion that it's a self-correcting thing. It's a self-correcting thing. And I always go on to that because it's the thing I like the most about the church community. We've made errors. Like Jarrell says, we made it over and over again. We've kept learning. And it's my sense right now that the kind of conversation we're having right now, we're ready to have deeper ones than we've ever had before. And we're more tolerant now. And we build trust amongst ourselves, you know, in new ways. And that when we have those conversations, we get to our deep connection to the historical experience that's within our public education system. And it's that connection which gives us finally the kindness and what you guys have done. So let me shift to that now, because what you've done now in Indianapolis is nothing short of extraordinary. You and I have talked, you know, a chat about the courageous charter school advocate. You've written a contributor column about the need for charter school operators to stay strong in movements like this. If I were to say what is one thing that's been different about the Indianapolis experience, it's being willing to be the Stork at the garden party again and again and again, to say the unspeakable thing, to have everybody get absolutely outraged at you, and to keep pushing because we know it aligns with our values, and ultimately the rest of society learns from what we've done. So can you guys just talk about, again, just what's your latest thinking about what our experience here about the raw need for just courage and staying together, you know, through the crucible of the Indianapolis experience, such that, you know, every other city in America that I think has a crucible awaiting them will be one that the charter school community helps that city navigate. Maybe I'll start with you, Brandon, you know, because no matter how good you are, Earl's gonna, like, you know, one up you, but.
yeah, you know, the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years here has been, you know, maybe a series of mini crucibles. And, you know, the reality is we got to a point where, you know, 2019, 2020, about half the kids in IPS attended charter and innovation schools. And I think we could have done one of two things. We could have said, we won, you know, like we got to a majority of the kids in schools that have better conditions. We got a lot of studies that show that they're fundamentally better than what was there before. And we could have said, all right, but we didn't, you know, and I think we ended up tripling down on the original North Star vision of the Mind Trust from 2006. Every child within our city needs access to a great school. And if you actually believe every child needs access to a great school, you morally can't stop. You have to keep pushing. You know, and the reality is there were a couple of radicalizing experiences for me several years ago. You know, one was when we had the conversation about the referendum, you know, when 40% of IPS kids are in innovation schools, right? Not even independent charter schools. 40% of IPS's own students were in innovation schools. And yet the proposal was to go out for hundreds of millions of dollars and not include any of those students in the referendum. That was a radicalizing moment. I remember sitting in North Carolina with my wife's family over Thanksgiving, working with our team, planning an organizing effort with pissed off school leaders who, just fundamentally didn't understand why that was fair. And then I think the last few years, we realized that if we can keep the sector together, the independent charters, the innovation schools, the varying school models, working across lines of difference within our own sector, if we could keep the sector together, we were incredibly strong and incredibly powerful. And the status quo wanted us to splinter. There were several points where there was a concerted, you and I talked about this, there were several points where there was a concerted strategy to pick off key school leaders and to get them to speak about, why we were being too aggressive, blah, blah, blah. And there were some moments where I was worried that we were going to splinter, but we never did. And it took those hard internal conversations within our own sector, around why collective action was important, why we needed to stick together, why honestly there are some tricks in the union playbook that we ought to really learn from, right? I mean, they say three things over and over again, whether or not they're true, and they get everybody to parrot the exact same talking points. In the charter sector, we love our autonomy, which is great, right? But we're all, not always comfortable working together. And I think over time, we have started to build that muscle, that everybody can have their individuality, everybody can lead in their own way, but there are collective things that we all need to come together on. And I think, the last year, working towards this system level reform, where charters will be fairly funded by 2031, where we're going to have one performance framework regardless of school type. We've shifted the ability to levy property taxes away from the district into a neutral entity, shared transportation facilities management. That ended up being a unifying force for the sector on the back end, because we can all look back and say, man, that was hard, that was rough. I didn't know how it was going to go at certain times, but now everybody can see the upside, right? And everybody can see why that vision for every kid was so important, and I actually think we're coming out of this stronger, more unified. It's not that there's not going to be family squabbles, which is important, right? Because we got to stay honest. But my sense is we could have folded, we could have splintered multiple times, and we didn't, and I think we're coming out of it now with a unified charter sector, and then hopefully, a more unified system of schools, where pretty much the district is now the largest CMO, and we've got charter operators in the district now competing on one playing field with one accountability system, and over time, we're going to grow great schools that are working for kids, and we're going to stop doing things that don't work, and that's going to be irregardless of sector.
So Earl, pretty high bar. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're blessed to have the Mind Trust do that work of keeping us together, and keeping us talking and getting in the same room. And as Brandon shared, people have self-interest, obviously, that sometimes diverge, but enough glue with the Mind Trust leadership and Brandon's leadership and the team's leadership to keep us all focused on what is ultimately going to be best for the sector, which will ultimately be best for our schools and our peace. You use the word courage. Actually, I am many things. Courageous is not one. Like when you think about courage, Howard Fuller reminded us this a month ago, where he's like, "This is the most low-key revolution and most comfortable revolution that I've ever seen," and he was mocking us to think that we're doing things that are so courageous. So I think that we're committed. I think that many people and many leaders in the sector are bold, but I don't think courageous is yet the word I've used, right? And my heroes are Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Ida B. Wells, Carter G. Right? So we're not doing it. Nobody's threatening to kill me, right? Nobody's threatening to cut off the economics of my school so that I don't have a job. Can't pay my bill. Nobody's doing that, right? And so, I decided to be quieter because it actually was hurting the work for my scholars. That's the only reason I decided to be quieter. And so I just repositioned myself to focus very much on my schools have so many beautiful things, but my network has so many problems. And so Earl, shut your mouth, focus on your problems, and when you're done, when you've resolved all your problems, you can then start to combat. So the good news is that will expire. But on the other side, I was worried about the economics of, hey, if I'm turning off donors and I'm telling you we need $2,000 to $3,000 extra dollars to serve our scholars, then I'm actually hurting my scholars, and so I have to be smart. But we're prayerfully a year from now, we're going to be in a place financially that we're self-funding. And when that comes, I will no longer be quiet.
So I was planning to ask for a couple of questions from the audience, but we're essentially out of time. So let me ask this one last one, sorry. Sorry, Earl. Earl, I hear you, and I agree, but I also feel like there's a degree of modesty, you know, in what you said about you're not courageous. And I also have Howard Phalen in my and I know full well what his meetings are, but he uses the word courageous. But I do think that there really are very potent forces that are here to hold our school system in a state of fixity. And there's very conscious efforts to say to those that will challenge that, woe is to you, woe is to you. And as it turns out, in the cycle of leadership in the charter school movement, the people that it's coming to have to say those things are going to be some of our younger leaders of color. And it's unfair that it's worked out that way, but they're going to have to say the unspoken, unspeakable thing. And it won't be enough because the personal stakes will be high. But it means so much more if you step out and you know that your house is with you, that your folk are with you. Charter folk is not just a way to label ourselves. It's a way to talk about our common reality, because I believe our commonness is what is going to give us the strength to push through. And so you've already been an incredible courageous life, and you wrote courageously at Charter Folk, and Brandon, you already know how I feel about what you do as well. So I would just say, keep your modesty. That's great. Downplay it, and but keep moderating and encouraging and supporting others that follow in your footsteps. But I want to just ask this last question. If you had people, and this is already happening, I know it's happening, you know, other cities in the country, they're not watching here, and they're wondering, could we do the same thing? Should we do the same thing? To people in other parts of the country now, what are you saying about the experience here? Of course, you got to be modesty, you can be off-putting, oh, I need a cookie cutter, no, not, but just general, or those that are curious in other cities. Early, we'll start with you. You know, what are you saying? And also, you're operating schools in other communities too yourself. You know, what do you say to people outside of Indianapolis about the degree to which they should be looking here for a possible way forward for their own town?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as Brandon shared, come an incredibly long way, have an incredibly long way to go. I think that there are tons of lessons. I think the advocacy that was done early on by the Lund Trust and has continued through its 20-year history has been critical to giving operators a chance. You need great operators, and you need individuals who believe they can do something special. Even the fact that we got approved for 10 charters has saved us at times when people didn't like what I said or didn't like the direction which we were going and tried to do things intentionally to crush PLA. My ability to use these charters and our ability to raise money outside of Indianapolis was critical in saying, no, we're going to stay on the course with the community thing. So I think making sure that you're capitalized or you have a few key donors that even if the system is opposing you will still stick with you because they know that you're trying to do the right thing for the community is critical. And then, you know, having fellowship opportunities, again, when you get to build some of that camaraderie that you need when the times get really hard and somebody offers you something, but they try to keep the rest of the charter sector out. If you say something bad about the rest, then you get money and you get rewarded, right? So walking through fellowships and just other times that we're brought together, at least you understand the humanity. I mean, you understand if you're human, you should, but you understand your peers are trying to do the right thing, and that maybe they're sometimes weak because it's going to help them and they need it and they're more vulnerable than maybe your organization is. So those are some of the things that I think folks can come and learn. And then, brand share. The results for Black and brown kids are unequivocally better as a result of the changes that have been made than they would have been. And that, for me, is the drive.
Yeah, I do think, that what we hear from Dr. Fuller is important, to keep our movement in context. And, to extend that even further, the most comfortable nonprofit job in America is a risk-averse education reform advocate who works with their funders to set incremental yearly goals they know they're going to hit, right? And just continues to wade through on a narrative that we're trying really hard and the politics are bad and this is not Indianapolis because they have something special. There was no hurricane. So I do think he's right. Like we're just comfortable, right? We go to really nice conferences at really nice hotels. We put in a good day's of work, but then at the end of the thing, like if it's just a job, then we're never going to reach the level of even a movement, let alone a courageous movement that changes the course of history. So I do think a lot about the incentive structure within the nonprofit advocacy world is one that incentivizes conservative advocacy. It incentivizes avoiding conflicts. It tells you shouldn't be in the paper when somebody says something bad at you because that might hurt the reputation of your organization. And all that matters. You can't be a madman and just do ridiculous things, and kind of run into a fire with no way out. But, to change a system that was not created to serve the kids that we're here to serve well, it's going to take conflict, right? It's going to take those moments of crucible. And I think at the end of the day, I think sometimes you just gotta start running and you gotta know when to sprint, when to jog, when to walk. But the minute that you stand still, or start thinking about your self-interest or why you shouldn't do something for kids, is probably the minute where you should go find a new job. And I do think as a movement, we should continue to ask ourselves, are we pushing hard enough? Are we thinking first about our self-interest and then the kids? Or are we flipping that around and saying, what am I willing to lose in this job that I'm in to actually change the system so that at the end of the day, the system is serving kids, not the other way around? And I don't think, we're clearly not martyrs. We're in, nice clothes on a nice stage on your podcast, right? But we set the bar so low within the education advocacy world that it's so easy to step over, that I do think we ought to raise the bar a few notches, and we ought to ask ourselves whether or not we're willing to lose something for this cause that we say that we truly believe in.
I'll close with this little story. I told it before, but there's a little nuance I don't think I actually, which is, aside from my wife, no one had heard the term charter folk for a while as I was gestating on whether to do this. But I didn't necessarily feel comfortable using the term charter folk because it's so clearly appropriation to voice and so on. And so I just held it for a while. But then I happened to be at lunch with Ramona in Washington, D.C., who was credited with having come up with the term African American to Jesse Jackson. And so I told her what I was thinking about doing. And I said that I have some misgivings about the name. Thinking about calling it charter folk. And she just almost looked up at the chair. She's like, I love that name. You have to do it. Yeah, absolutely. That's so good. I was like, okay, all right, forget it. It's taken care of. It's done. Now I have to do it, right? But this is the part that I haven't really shared too much, because there is confusion about sometimes is folk singular or is it plural? And I love it. I love it. And we have our individual roles to play. We have our individual organizations to play. And yet, across organizations, when we come together, both as individuals, but also as partners, as teams, that's the true power. So, the two of you, what you represent here, incredible backstories, incredible contributions, stayed at it for a very long time. And I know there are just many others here in the Indianapolis community. I've had breakfast with several others, and thank you for what you set me up with here. But what I see in Indianapolis is the example of folk staying at it over decades. And I will hope that your efforts, and I'm pretty sure they will, are going to inspire people across the country to do something similar. So thanks again for what you're doing. Thank you for hosting us for your Earl. You know you got me in your corner. I look forward to getting all sorts of additional content from you going forward. But thank you for having us here today.
Thank you.
You were just about to get it. Okay, no.